They dragged Salma Farouk across the polished floor of the private clinic as if she were nothing more than spilled water to be wiped away. Her headscarf had slipped. One sandal was missing. A hand clutched her swollen stomach while security guards shoved her toward the glass doors. Phones were already raised. Whispers turned into cruel laughter. Gold digger, paid womb. Across the driveway, beneath the shade of a black luxury SUV, stood Kunle Adebayo, tailored suit, unreadable face, heir to one of Lagos's most powerful families. He did not move until his phone rang. He answered, and whatever he heard made the color drain from his face. If you're watching right now, tell me, what country are you in and what time is it there? And if stories of justice, dignity, and unexpected truth speak to you, consider subscribing before we continue. Lagos never truly slept. Even at dawn, when the sky was still a pale gray and the air carried the scent of ocean salt mixed with diesel fumes, the city breathed. Under the third mainland bridge, life stirred long before executives in Ikoyi opened their curtains. Salma Farouk had learned to wake before the noise. She folded the thin wrapper she used as a blanket and tucked it carefully into a cracked plastic bag. Around her, other bodies shifted, women with children pressed to their chests, men who had once worn office shoes now barefoot on concrete, teenagers who had grown old too quickly. Salma sat up slowly. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. Still flat, still early. She exhaled. Across the city, in a glass tower overlooking Victoria Island, Kunle Adebayo stood in front of a window that stretched from floor to ceiling. The Atlantic shimmered in the distance. His reflection stared back at him, perfect suit, expensive watch-controlled expression. Behind him, his father's voice cut through the silence. "You are 38, Kunle." Chief Adewale Adebayo did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Our name will not end with you." Kunle kept his eyes on the horizon. There are other ways to secure succession. His father's walking stick tapped once against the marble floor. "I do not want other ways. I want blood." The word lingered in the room like smoke. Later that afternoon, Kunle's driver slowed the car near a congested stretch beneath the bridge. Traffic had stalled. Hawkers weaved between vehicles, balancing plantain chips, bottled water, phone chargers. Kunle rarely looked directly at the street. But that day he did. He noticed her because she wasn't begging. Salma sat against a concrete pillar, back straight, eyes focused on a worn paperback book resting in her lap. Her clothes were faded but clean. A headscarf wrapped neatly around her hair. When someone dropped a coin near her feet, she didn't scramble for it. She simply continued reading. Kunle frowned slightly. "Why is she there?" he asked. The driver glanced. "People end up anywhere, sir." Kunle watched as a small boy approached Salma, whispering something. She smiled faintly and handed him half of a loaf of bread from her bag. Not desperate, not loud, contained. Something about that unsettled him. "Stop the car," Kunle said. The driver hesitated. "Sir, stop." When Kunle stepped out, heat wrapped around him instantly. Heads turned. Expensive shoes did not belong here. Salma looked up when his shadow fell across her book. Their eyes met. There was no awe in hers, no pleading, only alertness. "You shouldn't stand in the sun," she said quietly. "It stains linen." Kunle blinked. It wasn't what he expected. "You speak as though you've worn it," he replied. "I have," she said calmly. "Once." Silence stretched between them, thick with the hum of traffic. "I have a proposal," Kunle said finally. Salma's fingers tightened slightly around the book. Most men who begin with that sentence expect something for free. "I don't." He crouched not too low, not fully equal but close enough to speak without shouting. "I need a child." She didn't flinch. "I don't need a wife," he continued. "I don't need affection. I need a legal heir. A surrogate arrangement. You would be compensated." properly, housing, medical care, financial security. The words were clinical, businesslike. Salma studied his face as if weighing a contract already drafted in invisible ink. "And what would you call me?" she asked. He paused. "A surrogate." "No," she said softly. "What would you call me when people ask who I am?" Kunle had no immediate answer. Traffic horns blared behind them. He straightened. "You would sign a non-disclosure agreement. My family's reputation remains intact. And mine." He didn't respond. That told her enough. Salma closed her book. "What guarantee do I have that I will not be discarded once your need is fulfilled? You would receive 20 million naira upon confirmation of pregnancy," Kunle said. "Another 30 upon delivery. An apartment deeded in your name." The numbers hung in the air. Around them, men argued over bus fares. A woman shouted prices for oranges. Salma's world narrowed. 20 million could rebuild more than survival. It could rebuild identity. But she knew men like him believed money erased humiliation. "I will require my own lawyer," she said. Kunle raised an eyebrow. "And independent medical oversight. You negotiate boldly for someone under a bridge." She met his gaze steadily. "You approached me." A faint shift crossed his face. Not irritation, not admiration, something more complicated. "Fine," he said. "My legal team will draft the agreement." "Not yours," Salma corrected gently. "Mine." For a moment, something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Very well." He reached into his jacket and handed her a sleek card embossed in gold. Kunle Adebayo, Executive Director, Adabio Capital Group. Salma didn't look at the title. She looked at his name. "I will think about it," she said. "You don't have much time," he replied. She almost smiled. "You'd be surprised what I have." That evening, in a modest office tucked behind a mosque in Surulere, Salma sat across from a middle-aged lawyer named Ibrahim Sule. He adjusted his glasses as he scanned the draft contract Kunle's team had sent within hours. "This is airtight," Ibrahim murmured. "For them." "And for me?" Salma asked. He hesitated. "They expect compliance." Salma's fingers brushed against a small brass key hidden in her bag. "They always do." 2 weeks later, Salma stepped into a quiet apartment in Lekki Phase 1. White walls, new furniture, no personal photographs. Mrs. Bisi Lawal, appointed as her wellness coordinator, offered a tight smile. "You will follow a strict schedule," Bisi explained. "Nutrition plans, media avoidance, no unapproved visitors." Salma nodded. From the balcony, she could see the city lights flickering like restless thoughts. Kunle visited only once that week. He stood near the doorway, maintaining distance. "Everything satisfactory?" he asked. "Yes," Salma replied. A silence lingered. "You understand this is purely contractual," he added. "Of course. And you will not attempt to complicate matters." Salma's hand rested lightly on her stomach. "Life is already complicated," she said. "We are only pretending it isn't." He studied her, unsettled again by the quiet weight of her words. Neither of them noticed the black SUV parked discreetly across the street. Inside, Damilola Okonkwo lowered her sunglasses slowly, so she murmured to her driver, "This is the woman." Her manicured nails tapped against her phone screen. "Find out everything about Salma Farouk," she ordered. The city had begun to shift. Contracts had been signed. Money had been wired. But beneath the polished surface of legality and power, something far more fragile had begun to grow. Not just a child. Truth. And truth, once awakened, never stayed silent for long. The apartment in Lekki was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No traffic horns, no shouting vendors, no generators coughing to life at midnight. The silence pressed against the walls like something expensive and suffocating. Salma Farouk, woke before sunrise, just as she had under the bridge. Old habits did not dissolve simply because the mattress was softer. For a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above her. The air conditioner hummed. Clean sheets brushed against her skin. Security, comfort, control. She turned onto her side and placed a hand gently over her abdomen. Still early, still uncertain. A knock came at exactly 6:30. Mrs. Bissy Lawal never knocked twice. Breakfast is prepared, Bissy announced as she entered, clipboard already in hand. Oatmeal, almond milk, supplements as prescribed. Salma sat up slowly. Good morning. Bissy gave a tight nod. Her gaze scanned Salma automatically, posture, skin tone, alertness, like she was inspecting a valuable machine. You will meet the obstetrician at 9. After that, a nutritionist will assess your diet history. You must avoid stress. Salma almost smiled at that. Avoid stress, as if stress were a street you could simply refuse to walk down. At the dining table, Salma noticed how spotless everything was. Cutlery aligned, curtains untouched, not a single personal photograph on the walls. This was not a home. It was a holding space. By 9:30, she was seated in a private medical suite in Victoria Island. The clinic's floors gleamed. Nurses wore polite smiles that did not quite reach their eyes. Ms. Farouk, the obstetrician, said briskly, scanning her chart. You understand this pregnancy must be closely monitored. There can be no surprises. No surprises, Salma repeated softly. An ultrasound gel pressed cold against her skin. The screen flickered. A faint, rhythmic pulse appeared. There it was, small, fragile, alive. The room fell into an unexpected hush. Even the nurse leaned closer. Salma's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't allowed herself to imagine this moment. It was supposed to be transactional, clinical, temporary. But the sound, tiny and steady, broke through something she had built carefully around her heart. The doctor cleared his throat. Heartbeat confirmed. Approximately 6 weeks. Mrs. Bissy scribbled notes quickly. Excellent, she murmured. Excellent, as if this were quarterly earnings. Kunle arrived later that afternoon. He stood near the doorway again, hands clasped behind his back. Well, he asked. Healthy, Bissy replied. Heartbeat detected. Kunle's jaw tightened slightly. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across his face. Salma watched him carefully. You can come closer, she said quietly. He hesitated before stepping toward the couch. She didn't show him the scan photo immediately. Instead, she studied his expression. Does this frighten you? She asked. Why would it? Because it makes it real. He looked at her then, not as an arrangement, not as a clause in a contract, but as a woman carrying something tied to his name. This is what I wanted, he said. Salma tilted her head slightly. Are you sure? Silence stretched between them. He shifted. My father expects an heir. The board expects continuity. Investors expect stability. And you. The question lingered longer than he liked. I expect efficiency, he answered finally. She handed him the small printed scan. For a fraction of a second, his carefully constructed composure cracked. His fingers trembled just slightly as he took it. Neither of them mentioned it. Life in the apartment followed a strict rhythm. Morning vitamins, afternoon check-ins, evening security patrols. Staff rotated quietly, always professional, always distant. But whispers traveled faster than professionalism. She's lucky, one housekeeper muttered in Yoruba, unaware Salma understood perfectly. From under a bridge to Lekki. Lucky, another scoffed. She sold her womb. Salma never confronted them. Instead, she corrected her pronunciation of English during phone calls. She referenced books casually. She quoted a financial article one afternoon while watching television, correcting a minor statistic error under her breath. Bissy heard her. You follow market reports. Bisi asked suspiciously. I read, Salma replied simply. Bisi narrowed her eyes slightly. You don't behave like someone from the street. Salma folded a page of her book neatly before answering. The street doesn't erase education. It only hides it. That night, Salma unlocked a small metal box she kept at the back of her wardrobe. Inside were two items, a worn brass key and a folded legal document torn at the corner. The heading was barely visible. Farouk Global Holdings Shareholder Agreement. She ran her fingers over the paper slowly. 3 years ago, her father had collapsed in a boardroom during what was supposed to be a routine merger meeting in Accra. Within weeks, company shares plummeted. Accounts were frozen. Legal accusations appeared from nowhere. She had trusted the wrong people. Men who smiled in public and sharpened knives in private. The media declared the Farouk empire bankrupt. Salma had disappeared shortly after. Not because she had nothing left, but because someone wanted her gone. Across the city, Damilola Okonkwo sat inside a rooftop lounge scrolling through discreet photographs taken by a private investigator. Salma entering a clinic. Salma speaking calmly to a lawyer. Salma reading alone on the balcony. Damilola's lips curled slightly. She's too composed, she murmured. Maybe she's just grateful her assistant offered. No, Damilola replied softly. That's not gratitude. Her phone buzzed. A contact labeled Papa. Senator Chinedu Okonkwo's voice came through steady and low. You're certain the child is viable? Yes. And Kunle already attached. A pause. Good, the senator said. Keep him distracted. Damilola leaned back in her chair, watching the sunset stain, Lagos orange. Don't worry, she whispered. I will. 2 weeks later, at a routine appointment, a minor complication surfaced. Elevated blood pressure. The doctor's tone shifted from confident to cautious. We must monitor closely, he warned. Stress is dangerous. On the drive back, Kunle sat beside Salma in the back seat for the first time. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, he said, If this becomes risky, we can terminate. Salma turned slowly toward him. Terminate for safety. For whose safety, she asked. He didn't answer. The car moved through evening traffic. Streetlights flickered on. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. She looked out the window. I regret that this is the only way you believe life can begin. He frowned. What does that mean? It means, she said gently, you do not know how to create anything without control. The words landed heavier than she intended. He stared ahead, jaw tight. You're forgetting your position. No, Salma replied softly. I remember it very clearly. The rest of the ride passed in silence. That night, Kunle remained in his car outside the apartment longer than usual before driving away. Inside, Salma stood on the balcony watching the city lights. Far below, Lagos pulsed with ambition, secrets, and survival. Somewhere beyond, the noise decisions were being made by men who believed power was permanent. Salma closed her eyes briefly. They would soon learn otherwise. Because this pregnancy was not the only thing growing quietly in Lagos, so was the truth. And the truth had begun to move. The first time Salma Farouk stepped into the Adabio family mansion in Ikoyi, she understood something immediately. This was not a house. It was a statement. Tall white columns framed the entrance. The driveway curved around a fountain sculpted from imported Italian stone. Uniformed guards stood at attention, their faces expressionless as the gates opened slowly. Mrs. Bisi Lawal adjusted Salma's shawl before the car door opened. Speak only when spoken to. Bisi murmured. Be respectful. Do not appear emotional. Salma almost laughed at the precision of the instructions. Appearances were everything here. Kunle waited at the top of the steps. He wore a dark kaftan embroidered with subtle gold thread. the fabric crisp and controlled like the rest of him. My mother insisted, he said quietly as Salma stepped out. It's better we address this directly. Salma nodded once. Of course. Inside the mansion smelled faintly of incense and polished wood. Portraits of past Adabio patriarchs lined the walls, men with stern eyes and heavy rings painted larger than life. Legacy lived loudly here. Alhaja Ronke Adebayo sat upright on a high-backed chair in the main sitting room. Her jele was perfectly sculpted, her expression sharper than the diamonds at her ears. She did not stand when Salma entered. So, Alhaja Ronke said slowly, her gaze sweeping over Salma from head to toe. This is her. Salma bowed her head slightly. Good afternoon, Ma. You speak English well, Alhaja Ronke observed. Yes, Ma. A long silence followed. And where did you learn such Polish? The older woman asked coolly. Salma met her eyes calmly. Life teaches quickly. Alhaja Ronke's lips tightened. Chief Adewale Adebayo entered moments later leaning lightly on his walking stick. His presence shifted the temperature of the room. He did not look at Salma immediately. Instead, he addressed Kunle. This is unnecessary, he said bluntly. We could have arranged this discreetly abroad. Kunle's jaw tightened. I chose differently. Chief Adewale finally turned his gaze toward Salma. You understand, he said, voice low but heavy, that you are here for a purpose, nothing more. Salma did not lower her eyes. I understand the contract, sir. The faintest flicker of irritation crossed his face. You will not embarrass this family. I have no intention of embarrassing anyone, she replied. Alhaja Ronke leaned forward slightly. Girls from the street often say that. The word girls hung in the air like an insult disguised as concern. Salma's spine remained straight. With respect, Ma, she said gently, I am not a girl. For a moment, silence cracked across the room. Kunle glanced sideways at her. He had expected compliance, not quiet defiance. News traveled quickly in elite Lagos circles. By evening, Damilola Okonkwo already knew Salma had visited the mansion. She arrived at a private dinner, uninvited, wearing a silver dress that caught the chandelier light like weaponized elegance. Kunle stiffened when he saw her. You weren't expected, he said evenly. I was never told I was replaced, she replied with a soft smile. Alhaja Ronke watched the exchange closely. Damilola approached Salma slowly, extending her hand. So you're the arrangement. Salma accepted the handshake without flinching. And you're the past, she replied calmly. A thin ripple of tension moved through the room. Damilola's smile sharpened. You must be very brave, she murmured, voice low enough for only Salma to hear. Or very desperate. Sometimes they look the same, Salma answered quietly. Damilola stepped back, studying her. She doesn't look desperate, Damilola said aloud to the room. She looks strategic. Kunle's eyes narrowed. That's enough. But Damilola wasn't finished. I just hope, she continued sweetly, that she understands how easily contracts can disappear. The implication was clear. Salma felt it. A warning. After dinner, as guests filtered out, Damilola stood beside her father's black SUV outside the mansion. Senator Chinedu Okonkwo stepped out slowly, adjusting his agbada. You've seen her? He asked. Yes, and she's not what we expected. The senator's gaze darkened slightly. No one survives 3 years missing from the financial world by accident, he said quietly. Watch her closely. The next week, whispers began circulating among Lagos society blogs. Anonymous posts, speculation, photos of Salma entering clinics. Headlines that blurred fact and fiction. Who is the mystery woman carrying Adabio? Heir from under bridge to billionaire baby Salma. Noticed the shift immediately. Staff in the apartment avoided eye contact. Security tightened. Mrs. Beacey became colder. "You must avoid balconies," Beacey instructed sharply one afternoon. "Photographers use long lenses." Salma nodded. She had expected this stage. Humiliation always came before exposure. But what unsettled her most was not the gossip. It was Kunle's growing distance. He visited less frequently. Calls became shorter. One evening she confronted him gently. "Are you ashamed?" she asked. He paused mid-sentence. "Of what? Of being seen with me?" His silence was answer enough. "This was never meant to be emotional," he replied stiffly. "It became public," she said softly. "That changes everything." Kunle ran a hand through his hair. "My family is under scrutiny. Investors are asking questions. You don't understand the pressure." Salma's gaze hardened slightly. "You think pressure is exclusive to boardrooms?" He exhaled sharply. "This arrangement is delicate." "No," she corrected quietly. "It is human." The word unsettled him. Human. He had framed this entire process as structured, contractual, contained. But humanity resisted containment. Days later, Alhaja Ronke summoned Salma privately. They sat across from each other in a smaller sitting room, filled with antique sculptures. "You may believe you are special," Alhaja Ronke began calmly, "but do not mistake temporary relevance for permanence." Salma listened silently. "When this child is born, your chapter closes." Salma folded her hands carefully in her lap. "With respect, ma," she said evenly. "Children are not chapters, they are beginnings." Alhaja Ronke's eyes flashed. "You will not attempt to bind my son emotionally." Salma's voice remained steady. "I cannot bind what is not already willing." For the first time, the older woman faltered. Salma stood slowly. "May I be excused?" Alhaja Ronke waved her away without responding. That night alone in the apartment, Salma unlocked her metal box again. She unfolded the torn document fully this time. Farouk Global Holdings. Her father's signature at the bottom. She traced it gently. Outside, Lagos traffic roared faintly in the distance. Inside, life moved quietly beneath her palm. Contracts, power, reputation, they were all fragile. Damilola believed she was cornering a desperate woman. The Adabio family believed they were managing a risk. Kunle believed he could compartmentalize emotion. All of them were wrong. Because Salma Farouk was not surviving this arrangement, she was navigating it. And somewhere beyond the gossip and guarded gates, the truth about her disappearance, about the corporate coup that had erased her family's name, was inching closer to the surface. The smear campaign had begun, but so had something else. Reckoning, and it would not knock politely when it arrived. The first place Salma felt like herself again was not the apartment in Lekki. It was a small open-air market in Yaba. Mrs. Beacey had protested when Salma requested fresh vegetables instead of pre-selected organic deliveries. "It's unnecessary," Beacey insisted. "Everything can be ordered. I prefer to see what I eat," Salma replied gently. After several days of negotiation, Beacey allowed a supervised trip, 2 security men walking at a discreet distance pretending not to watch. The market smelled of roasted corn-dried fish, ripe mangoes. Women shouted prices with theatrical outrage. Children darted between stalls. Life here did not whisper. It roared. Salma moved slowly, touching tomatoes, lifting bunches of ugu leaves with careful attention. "You don't look like someone who usually shops here," a voice said warmly. Salma turned to see an older woman with bright eyes and a wide wrapper tied tightly around her waist. "My name is Mama Efe," the woman continued, "and you look like someone who knows the difference between real pepper and decoration." Salma smiled for the first time that morning. "I prefer the real kind," she said. Mama Eve laughed, handing her a small pepper to inspect. You speak softly, Mama Eve observed. But your eyes don't. What do they say? Salma asked lightly. They say you have fallen before, Mama Eve replied, but you are not finished falling. Salma held the pepper between her fingers. I hope you mean rising. Mama Eve's smile widened knowingly. The security men shifted impatiently nearby. Before Salma left, Mama Eve slipped an extra handful of fresh mint into her bag. For strength, she said quietly. Salma understood. Strength did not always come from contracts. Sometimes it came from strangers who saw you clearly. At the clinic that week, Dr. Amara Nwosu took over Salma's care. Unlike the previous doctor, Dr. Amara did not treat her like an asset. She spoke to her directly. How are you feeling? Emotionally, she asked during one appointment. Salma hesitated. Stable, she replied. Dr. Amara studied her face carefully. That wasn't what I asked. Salma exhaled slowly. I feel observed. Dr. Amara nodded. That tends to happen when pregnancy is politicized. Salma's lips curved faintly. That's one word for it. After the checkup, as Bisi stepped outside to take a phone call, Dr. Amara lowered her voice slightly. You're not who they think you are. Salma froze for half a second. I'm not sure who they think I am, she replied carefully. A homeless woman who stumbled into fortune, Dr. Amara said calmly. But you read the financial newspapers in the waiting room. You corrected a statistic yesterday. Salma said nothing. Dr. Amara's expression softened. You don't have to tell me anything, but if you ever need a doctor who listens beyond the chart, I'm here. For the first time in months, Salma felt something close to safety. Back at the apartment, gossip had intensified. One afternoon, Salma overheard two staff members speaking near the kitchen. They say she used to be rich, one whispered. Lost everything in some scandal. Or maybe she stole it, the other replied. Salma stepped into the doorway. Good afternoon, she said calmly. The women jumped startled. I hope whatever story you choose. Salma continued gently. You make it interesting. She walked away before they could respond. Upstairs, she locked the bedroom door and opened the metal box again. The torn legal document stared back at her. Farouk Global Holdings. Her father's signature. Her own name listed among shareholders. She remembered the night everything collapsed. Board members had gathered in Accra for what was presented as a strategic expansion meeting. Investors from Nigeria and South Africa were present. Among them had been Senator Chinedu Okonkwo, charming, persuasive, smiling too easily. Within weeks, accusations of fraud surfaced. Bank accounts were frozen under investigation. Media outlets ran synchronized reports. Her father had suffered a stroke days later. And then, threats, anonymous warnings, disappear quietly, for your safety. Salma had obeyed, not because she was weak, but because she needed time. Time to trace what had been stolen, time to find proof, time to disappear long enough to survive. 3 years under different names, small jobs, shelters, watching from the margins while the world declared her erased, until she crossed paths with Kunle Adebayo, a man whose family empire had quietly expanded into territories once dominated by Farouk Global. A coincidence or not. Across the city, Damilola Okonkwo sat in her father's private study. You're certain? She asked sharply. Yes, Senator Okonkwo replied, placing a printed report on the desk. Farouk Global's dissolution allowed multiple investment groups to absorb their energy subsidiaries. And Adabio Capital was one of them. Indirectly, the senator said. Through layered acquisitions, Damilola's eyes narrowed. If Salma is who I suspect, she would have motive, her father finished. Damilola leaned back slowly. Then we must make sure she looks unstable. The senator's gaze hardened. Handle it carefully. Damilola smiled thinly. I always do. 2 days later, a small envelope arrived at the apartment reception desk. No sender. Inside was a printed photograph. Salma at the market with Mama Efe, a red circle drawn around her stomach. Across the image, a single word written in black ink: fraud. Salma stared at it without blinking. Bissy noticed her stillness. "What is it?" Bissy asked. "Nothing," Salma replied calmly, but inside something cold settled. This was no longer gossip. It was positioning. That evening, Kunle visited unexpectedly. He looked tired. "There are rumors circulating," he said without preamble. "There always are," Salma replied. "Some suggest you targeted me deliberately." Salma met his eyes steadily. "Do you believe that he hesitated?" "I don't know what to believe." She nodded slowly. "That's honest." Kunle paced once across the room. "If this damages my family's standing." Salma stood before he could finish. "You approached me," she said softly but firmly. "You drafted the contract. You calculated the risks. I calculated business risk," he snapped. "And I calculated survival," she answered. Silence cracked between them. He stopped pacing. "Who are you, Salma?" The question hung in the air like a door slightly opened. She could have told him then. She could have revealed the truth. But it was not time. "I'm the woman carrying your child," she said quietly. He searched her face, unsatisfied. Nothing more. Salma's gaze didn't waver. For now, Kunle left unsettled. That night Salma stood again on the balcony watching the city pulse below. Somewhere in Lagos deals were being negotiated. Files were being altered. Stories were being shaped. She placed both hands over her abdomen. "This is not about revenge," she whispered softly to herself. It was about restoration, of name, of truth, of dignity. They believed she had fallen into their world by accident. They believed she was lucky. But Salma Farouk had not stumbled into this arrangement. She had stepped into it, carefully, and as the campaign against her began to sharpen, she understood something clearly. They were afraid. Because a woman who survives disappearance is far more dangerous than a woman who begs for rescue. And Salma had never begged, not once. Kunle Adebayo had always believed control was the highest form of strength. Control over markets, control over perception, control over emotion. But control began slipping in the smallest, quietest ways. It started with a conversation he did not expect. He arrived at the apartment late one evening, long after traffic had thinned and the city lights reflected faintly off the lagoon. He looked exhausted, tie-loosened shoulders, heavy with something he refused to name. Salma was seated on the floor, a book open beside her. Not a novel this time, an economics journal. She didn't rush to stand. "You read?" that he asked, genuinely surprised. She closed it calmly. "Yes, that's not light material. I never preferred light." He studied the cover. It was an article analyzing post-acquisition volatility in West African energy sectors. He frowned. "That's very specific." "So is survival," she replied softly. He sat down across from her, abandoning his usual distance. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was no longer hostile. It was curious. "You said once," he began slowly, "that I don't know how to create without control." "You asked me to be honest," she reminded him. "And now I'm asking you something else." She waited. "What would you have done?" he asked, "if I had never approached you?" Salma looked at him for a long moment. "I would have continued what enduring." The word unsettled him. "You speak like someone who has lost more than money," he said. A faint shadow crossed her face. "I have." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me." She shook her head gently. "Not yet." The refusal did not feel defensive. It felt measured. Kunle realized then that Salma never reacted impulsively. She responded. There was calculation in her calm. But not manipulation. Something else. Depth. Across town, Damilola Okonkwo, paced inside her father's study again. "She's getting comfortable," Damilola said sharply. "Kunle spends hours there now." Senator Chinedu Okonkwo adjusted his glasses. "Attachment complicates leverage. She needs to be destabilized." The senator's expression darkened. "No overt aggression. Subtlety wins wars." Damilola stopped pacing. "I have an idea." 2 days later, a popular Lagos blog published a fresh article, "Mystery Surrogates, Past Raises Questions." The article included blurry images from Salma's earlier years, unflattering angles, taken from old corporate events in Accra. A caption suggested financial misconduct tied to a dissolved company, Farouk Global Holdings. The name was not fully clear in the image, but Salma recognized it immediately. The past was no longer whispering. It was knocking. When Kunle arrived that evening, his jaw was tight. "You said nothing about corporate involvement," he said without greeting. Salma stood near the window. "I wasn't asked. This article implies fraud." "Does it?" she asked calmly. He placed his phone on the table. "Investors are nervous. Are you?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated. "I need to know if this arrangement exposes me." There it was. Exposure, not concern for her. Concern for himself. Salma inhaled slowly. "Everything exposes you," she said quietly. "That is the cost of visibility. Don't speak in riddles. I'm not." He stepped closer. "Were you involved in that company?" "Yes." The honesty hit him like a sudden shift in wind. "In what capacity, shareholder?" His eyes widened slightly. "That's impossible." "Why, you were under a bridge. People fall," she said evenly. "It does not mean they were never standing." He ran a hand across his face. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You never asked who I was," she replied softly. "You asked what I could provide." Silence fell heavy between them. For the first time, Kunle saw something beyond composure. Not desperation, not ambition, restraint. "You think I used you," he said quietly. "You did," she answered. The bluntness landed hard. "But I agreed," she continued gently. "That makes it mutual." He sank into the chair behind him. "This changes things." "Yes," she said. "It complicates the contract." "No," Salma corrected softly. "It complicates your assumptions." Later that week, Salma insisted on visiting Mama Efe again. Bisi protested, but Kunle surprisingly allowed it. "Let her breathe," he told Bisi. At the market, Mama Efe noticed the tension in Salma's shoulders immediately. "They're pushing you," the older woman observed. "Yes. And you, I'm not moving." Mama Ifa nodded approvingly. "You don't look afraid." "I am Salma," admitted quietly. The confession surprised even her. Mama Ifa squeezed her hand. "Fear means you still care. That's not weakness." As they spoke, a man stood across the market pretending to inspect yams while discreetly recording them. That evening, a new video circulated online. It showed Salma at the market laughing softly with Mama Efe. The caption read, "Billionaire baby mama living double life." Comments flooded in. Gold digger, manipulator, actress. Kunle watched the video 3 times. He didn't see manipulation. He saw peace. But perception rarely matched truth. His phone rang. It was his father. "This is spiraling," Chief Adebayo said bluntly. "We cannot afford scandal. It's manageable." Kunle replied, though he was no longer certain. "End it if necessary." The word lingered. End. Kunle hung up slowly. For the first time since this arrangement began, he considered the possibility of walking away. Not because of Salma, because of fear. He drove to the apartment without announcing himself. Salma was on the balcony when he arrived, staring at the city. "They want me to terminate the contract," he said quietly. She didn't turn. "And you?" He hesitated. "I don't know." She faced him slowly. "This is the first honest thing you've said all week." He exhaled sharply. "You don't understand the pressure." "I understand being erased," she replied softly. "Pressure is lighter than that." The words cut deeper than she intended. He stepped closer. "If there is more to your past, tell me now." Salma held his gaze steadily. "There is." "Then tell me." She shook her head. "Not yet." "Why? Because you're still deciding whether I'm an asset or a liability." The truth struck him cleanly. He opened his mouth to argue, but found nothing. Because she was right. He had not decided. He was still measuring risk. Salma stepped past him gently. "When you stop calculating," she said softly, "come back." He stood there long after she left the balcony. The city below hummed with relentless ambition. For the first time, Kunle felt something unfamiliar, tightening in his chest. Not obligation, not control, something far more dangerous. Doubt. And doubt was the beginning of unraveling, because once a man questions his own certainty, the empire built on it begins to tremble. Somewhere in Lagos, Damilola watched the online reactions multiply. She smiled faintly. She believed she was tightening the net. What she did not realize was this Salma Farouk had survived far worse than public opinion. And the more they pushed her into the light, the closer they came to exposing truths they had buried carefully for years. The game had shifted, quietly, irreversibly, and none of them were fully prepared for what was coming next. The day Salma collapsed, Lagos was loud, too loud. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the market in Balogun pulsed like a living heart. Vendors shouted prices over one another. Car horns layered into a restless symphony. Heat pressed down like an accusation. Salma had insisted on going out again. "I won't live in a glass box," she told Kunle 2 days earlier. He hadn't argued this time. Maybe because something inside him had shifted. Maybe because he was tired of fighting what he didn't fully understand. Mrs. Bissy trailed behind as usual, tension visible in the tight set of her shoulders. 2 security men kept a watchful distance. Salma moved slowly between fabric stalls, one hand resting unconsciously against her abdomen. She paused often, not from weakness but from thought. Since the article linking her to Farouk Global surfaced, the air around her had changed. People didn't just look at her anymore. They evaluated her, measured her, judged her. She could feel it. Mama Efe noticed immediately. "You are pale today," Mama Efe said, narrowing her eyes. "Have they fed you stress again?" Salma smiled faintly. "Just headlines." Mama Efe clicked her tongue. "Headlines don't grow children, food does." Salma laughed softly, but the laugh faded quickly. A ringing started in her ears. At first she thought it was just the market noise amplifying. Then the ground seemed to tilt slightly beneath her sandals. She blinked once, twice. The colors blurred. Salma Mama Ife's voice came from somewhere distant. Salma tried to answer. Instead, her knees buckled. The world tilted sideways. Someone screamed. The next thing she felt was the unforgiving heat of concrete against her cheek. The market noise shifted from commerce to chaos. "She's pregnant. Call someone, move back." Mrs. Bissy pushed through the crowd, frantically. "Clear space," she shouted. One of the security men lifted Salma carefully. Her head lolled slightly, breath shallow but present. Mama Eve's hand trembled as she touched Salma's arm. "Don't you dare leave me, child," she whispered. The private hospital in Victoria Island looked colder than usual. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Salma was rushed into the emergency wing. Kunle arrived within minutes, breath uneven, tie crooked. He had left a board discussion mid-sentence. He found Mrs. Bissy arguing with a receptionist. "We have authorization," Bissy snapped. The receptionist's smile was tight and professional. "There are payment protocols for emergency admissions." Kunle stepped forward. "Admit her immediately," he said sharply. The receptionist hesitated. Behind her, two nurses whispered quietly. "That's her," one murmured. "The surrogate." Kunle heard it. The word struck him differently now. "Admit her," he repeated, voice colder. They moved, but the whispers didn't stop. As Salma was wheeled past the nurse's station, she stirred faintly. Her eyes fluttered open just long enough to catch fragments of conversation. Rented womb, gold digger, corporate scandal girl. The words slid under her skin like needles. She closed her eyes again, not from weakness this time, but from exhaustion. Inside the examination room, monitors beeped steadily. Dr. Amara Nwosu stood over Salma, calm but focused. "Blood pressure elevated," she said. "Severe dehydration, stress response." Kunle hovered near the door. "Is the baby safe?" he asked immediately. Dr. Amara glanced at him sharply. "They are both patients." The correction was subtle, but deliberate. Kunle fell silent. After what felt like hours, Dr. Amara stepped out to speak with him privately. "She needs stability," the doctor said. "Not just nutrition, not just medication." "What are you implying?" "I'm implying," Dr. Amara replied evenly, "that humiliation has physiological effects." Kunle's jaw tightened. "I don't control public gossip." "No," she agreed. "But you control how she is treated." The words landed heavier than he expected. Salma regained full consciousness later that evening. The hospital room was quiet now. The sun had dipped low, casting golden light through the blinds. Kunle sat beside the bed. He looked different, not composed, not distant, uncertain. "You collapsed," he said softly. "I noticed," she replied faintly. He almost smiled. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well." "I wasn't feeling unwell," she corrected gently. "I was feeling watched." He looked down. She shifted slightly in the bed. "Is the baby safe?" she asked. "Yes." Relief softened her features. Silence settled between them. Then she spoke again. "I heard them, heard who the nurse is." Kunle's expression hardened. "I'll speak to administration. It won't change anything," she said quietly. He frowned. "They disrespected you." "No," she corrected. "They revealed what they believe." "And what do you believe?" he asked, suddenly. She turned her head toward him. "I believe you are still deciding whether I'm worth defending." The honesty stung. He opened his mouth to deny it, but stopped. Because she was right. At the market when she fell, he had thought first of reputation, not her. He had corrected himself, but not quickly enough. "I came," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "You came. But you hesitated." The word hung between them. Kunle exhaled slowly. "You don't make this easy." Salma's gaze sharpened slightly. "I'm not here to be easy." Across town, Damilola watched the news update on her tablet. "Pregnant woman linked to Adabio, heir hospitalized." She tilted her head slightly. "Fragile," she murmured. Her assistant looked uneasy. "What if this backfires?" "It won't," Damilola replied. "He will choose legacy over complication." She believed it completely. She didn't yet understand that something inside Kunle had begun to fracture. Later that night, Chief Adewale called his son. "This incident must be contained," the older man said firmly. "It's under control," Kunle replied. "If she is unstable, she's not. If she becomes a liability, she is carrying your grandchild," Kunle interrupted sharply. The silence on the other end thickened. "You're becoming emotional," Chief Adewale said. Kunle ended the call without responding. In the hospital room, Salma lay awake long after Kunle left. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the market collapse in her mind. Weakness, exposure, whispers. But something else lingered too. Kunle's expression when he thought she was unconscious. Fear, not of scandal, of loss. She recognized it because she had worn that fear before, when her father collapsed in that boardroom years ago, when power dissolved overnight, when the world rewrote her identity without permission. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Amara stepped inside. "How are you, really?" the doctor asked quietly. Salma met her eyes. "Tired." Dr. Amara nodded. "You are carrying more than a child." Salma's throat tightened slightly. "Yes." Dr. Amara adjusted the IV gently. "You don't have to fight alone." Salma looked toward the window where Lagos lights flickered like restless secrets. "I know," she said softly. But knowing and trusting were different things, and trust, like truth, was growing slowly, unpredictably inside a world built on control. The collapse in the market had shaken more than her body. It had shaken perception, and perception, once cracked, rarely returned to its original shape. Kunle believed he had responded quickly enough. Damilola believed she was tightening pressure. The Adabio family believed this was a temporary disturbance. They were all watching Salma, measuring her, judging her fragility. What none of them yet understood was this: Salma Farouk had survived disappearance. She had survived betrayal. She had survived being erased. A fainting spell would not break her, but it might break something else, and the moment a powerful man begins to question where his loyalty truly lies, the empire around him begins to tremble. When Salma was discharged 2 days later, the air outside the hospital felt heavier than before. Not because of the heat, because of the cameras. Someone had tipped off the press. Microphones hovered like insects. Flashbulbs burst against the late afternoon sun. Reporters called her name with forced politeness. "Ms. Farouk, were you hospitalized due to complications? Is the contract still valid? Did the Adabio family abandon you?" Kunle stepped forward, instinctively placing himself slightly in front of her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tender. But it was visible. Salma noticed. Security formed a barrier as they moved toward the SUV. The questions followed them like smoke. Inside the vehicle, silence settled heavily. "You didn't have to do that," Salma said quietly. "Do what? Stand in front of me." Kunle kept his eyes forward. "Yes, I did." It was the first time he had said something without calculating how it sounded. Salma leaned back against the seat. Outside, Lagos traffic resumed its indifferent rhythm. The next morning, the clinic called with an urgent request. "There's a discrepancy in the latest test results," the administrator said stiffly over the phone. Kunle frowned. "What discrepancy?" "Markers indicating elevated risk. The pregnancy may not be viable long-term." Salma, seated across the room, watched his expression change. "Send the full report," he said. After he ended the call, he turned to her. "They're recommending further evaluation." Salma studied his face carefully. "Or termination?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "The doctor said it may be safest." "For whom?" she asked again. The question landed harder this time. Kunle exhaled. "They're saying stress could cause complications. If this continues." "If what continues?" Salma pressed gently. "The publicity." She nodded slowly. "So the solution is to erase the evidence." He stiffened. "That's not what I meant." "It is," she said quietly. He looked away, because it was easier to look at the skyline than into her eyes. At the clinic later that day, Dr. Amara reviewed the test results personally. Her brow furrowed. "These markers don't align," she said slowly. "What does that mean?" Kunle asked. "It means," Dr. Amara replied carefully, "that this lab work may have been altered." Silence filled the room. Salma's fingers tightened around the edge of the examination table. "Altered," Kunle repeated. Dr. Amara nodded. "I want a second independent test, immediately." Outside the office, Mrs. Bisi shifted nervously. "This is becoming complicated," she murmured under her breath. Inside, Salma closed her eyes briefly. It had begun. They were escalating. Across the city, Damilola sat in a sleek cafe overlooking the lagoon. Her phone vibrated. "It's done," a voice said quietly on the other end, and she asked. The revised results were delivered. "Good." She stirred her coffee slowly. "If the pregnancy appears unstable, they'll end it quietly," she murmured. "And if they don't, they will," she replied confidently. Kunle won't risk legacy for a scandal. She believed she understood him. She did not realize she was underestimating what doubt had already done. By evening, the independent test results arrived. Dr. Amara called personally. "Healthy," she said firmly. "No elevated risk. The previous report was falsified." Kunle felt something cold settle in his chest. "Who would benefit from that?" he asked. Dr. Amara's silence was answer enough. When he hung up, he looked at Salma differently. Not as a liability, not as a contract, but as someone under attack. "They tried to force a decision," she said quietly. "Yes, and you almost let them." The truth stung. He didn't argue, because for a brief moment that morning when termination had been suggested, relief had flickered inside him. Relief at the possibility of ending the storm. He hated that she had seen it. "I'm sorry," he said finally. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was real. Salma studied him carefully. "Are you apologizing to protect me?" she asked, "or to protect yourself from who you might become?" He had no answer, because it was both. That night, Chief Adabio summoned Kunle to the mansion again. The older man did not sit. "You will not allow this to spiral further," he said firmly. "The tests were falsified," Kunle replied. "Then someone made a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake." Chief Adabio's gaze sharpened. "You're becoming paranoid. Or observant." Silence cracked between them. "You're defending her," his father said slowly. "I'm defending truth." The word hung dangerously in the room. "Truth is flexible," Chief Adabio replied calmly. "Stability is not." Kunle felt something shift permanently in that moment. "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly. He left before his father could respond. Back at the apartment, Salma sat alone on the balcony again. The city lights shimmered below. Her phone vibrated. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A deep voice spoke calmly on the other end. "Miss Farouk." Her breath caught. It had been years since anyone used her surname with that tone. "You've been difficult to reach," the voice continued. "Who is this?" she asked carefully. "A friend of your father." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "You should not be where you are," the man said quietly. "It is no longer safe." "Safe was never promised," she replied evenly. "There are movements happening," he continued. "Board records resurfacing. Share transfers questioned." Her pulse quickened. "They're circling," he added. "They've always been," she said. A pause. "You may need protection." Salma looked toward the skyline. "I have it." She ended the call slowly. Behind her, the apartment door opened softly. Kunle stepped onto the balcony. "You're shaking," he observed. "Am I?" "Yes." She turned toward him. For the first time, she said quietly, "You are not the only one being watched." He frowned. "What does that mean?" She held his gaze. "It means this was never just about a child." The words landed heavier than any accusation. He felt it now, the pattern, the manipulation, the falsified results, the smear articles. This was not random gossip. It was strategy, and if someone was willing to tamper with medical records, they were capable of far more. "Who are you really, Salma?" he asked again, voice softer now. She stepped closer. "When the time is right," she said, "you won't need to ask." Below them, Lagos hummed with ambition and secrets. In offices across the city, documents were being reviewed. Old board meeting minutes were being pulled from archives. Financial trails were beginning to glow faintly under scrutiny. Damilola believed she was tightening control. Chief Adewale believed this was manageable. But control was already unraveling. Because once falsified evidence enters the light, it demands explanation. And explanation leads to exposure. Salma Farouk had survived disappearance. Now she was surviving visibility. And somewhere beneath the polished surface of Lagos power, something long buried was beginning to rise. Not loudly, not yet, but inevitably. The game had moved beyond contracts, beyond pregnancy, beyond reputation, and those who had manipulated truth for years were about to discover something far more dangerous than scandal: accountability. Salma left before dawn. No announcement, no argument, no farewell. She waited until the apartment was wrapped in that thin, fragile silence that only exists between night guards changing shifts and morning drivers starting engines. She dressed simply, plain headscarf, loose dress, flat sandals. She did not pack much, just the metal box, the brass key, the torn Farouk Global document, and a small envelope of cash she had insisted remain untouched from the contract advance. She paused at the balcony one last time. The city was still dark, but faint light hovered on the horizon. "I won't disappear for them again," she whispered softly. Then she left. Kunle arrived at the apartment later that morning to find the air different. Not messy, not chaotic, empty. Mrs. Bisi met him at the door, her usual composure fractured. "She's gone," Bisi said. Gone where Kunle demanded. "She left before shift change. Security assumed she was with you." He felt something drop inside his chest. A cold, sinking weight. "She's pregnant," he said sharply. "I know." He stepped inside, scanning the living room as if she might materialize from behind a door. Her phone, left behind. That frightened him more than anything. No phone meant no tracking, no contact, no trace. For the first time since this arrangement began, fear overpowered pride. "Get the car," he said. Lagos was enormous when you were searching for someone who didn't want to be found. Kunle drove himself first to the hospital. Nothing. Then to the market in Yaba. Mama F looked up sharply when she saw him approaching alone. "Where is she?" he asked immediately. Mama Eve studied him for a long moment before answering. "Where she needed to go. That's not helpful. It's not meant to be," she replied calmly. Kunle's jaw tightened. "She's carrying my child, and she is carrying herself," Mama Eve countered. He had no argument against that. "Did she say anything?" he asked, voice softer now. Mama Eve sighed. She said she would not collapse in a house built on silence. The words struck him harder than expected. "Do you know where she is?" he pressed. Mama Ifa hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "Even if I did," she said gently, "you would have to decide why you're looking." He turned away, frustrated, because he didn't know. Was he searching for control, for protection, or for her? By evening, Kunle's search expanded beyond markets and clinics. He visited women's shelters, community centers, underpasses where people slept beneath tarpaulins and broken billboards. He had never stepped into these spaces before. Now he walked through them with urgency he couldn't explain. In one shelter in Surulere, a volunteer scanned his face carefully. "You're the Adabio heir," she said. "Yes, we don't house contracts here." The words burned. "She's not a contract," he said, surprising even himself. The volunteer tilted her head. "Is that what she is to you?" He didn't answer, because the truth was still forming. Salma sat in a small room above the shelter's main hall. The walls were painted pale blue. A single window overlooked a narrow street. Children's laughter drifted up from below. She had chosen this place deliberately. Not the bridge, not a hotel. A shelter for women escaping control. She felt oddly calm. When the volunteer knocked softly on her door, She already knew who it would be. "He's here," the woman said quietly. Salma closed her eyes briefly. "Let him up." Kunle entered slowly. He looked different, less polished, more exposed. "You left," he said. "Yes," without telling me. "You would have tried to stop me." He didn't deny it. "You're not safe out here," he insisted. She tilted her head slightly. "And I was safe in there." He hesitated. Safer. Safer for who, she asked, gently. Silence stretched. He stepped further into the room. "I was trying to protect you." "No," she corrected calmly. "You were trying to protect your position." The bluntness hit him cleanly. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to do both," he admitted. It was the most honest sentence he had spoken since they met. Salma studied him carefully. "You are not choosing between me and your position," she said softly. "You are choosing between truth and comfort." The words settled heavily in the room. He sat down across from her. "Then tell me the truth," he said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the torn document. Farouk Global Holdings. His eyes widened. "I remember this company," he murmured. "Energy sector. Collapsed after allegations." "It did not collapse," she corrected quietly. "It was dismantled." He looked at her sharply. "You're saying I am Salma Farouk," she said steadily, "daughter of Idris Farouk." The name landed like a dropped glass. Kunle's mind raced. Idris Farouk, the Ghanaian-Nigerian energy magnate who had vanished from headlines after a fraud investigation. The assets that quietly redistributed through acquisition chains, some of which passed through Adabio capital. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I was meant to disappear," she replied. His pulse quickened. "You think my family?" "I think," she said carefully, "that powerful men often collaborate when profit is involved." He stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "You're accusing my father. I'm telling you what happened to mine." The room felt smaller now. He turned toward her. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" "Because I didn't know which side you stood on." "And now?" She held his gaze steadily. "I still don't." The honesty cut deeper than accusation. "Back in Ikoyi, Damilola received a call from one of her private investigators. She's at a shelter," the man reported. Damilola's eyes narrowed. "Alone, no. He found her." She exhaled slowly. Of course he did. She paced toward the window overlooking the city. "He's slipping," she murmured. Her father's voice came through the speakerphone. Then tightened pressure. "How remind him what he stands to lose." In the shelter room, Kunle stopped pacing. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "this is bigger than us." "Yes. Why enter this arrangement at all?" Salma's expression softened faintly. "Because proximity reveals patterns." He frowned. "You used me." She didn't flinch. "You used me first." Silence filled the space. They stared at each other, not as contract partners, not as adversaries, but as two people standing at the edge of something neither fully controlled anymore. "I need proof," he said quietly. "You'll have it," she replied. "But understand this." She stood carefully, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. "This child will not be collateral." The firmness in her voice left no room for negotiation. Kunle nodded slowly. For the first time, the arrangement no longer felt like a transaction. It felt like a crossroads. Because if her father had been dismantled deliberately, and if Adabio capital had benefited, then this was no longer about reputation. It was about accountability, and accountability threatened everything. Kunle looked around the small shelter room. It was humble, simple, but it felt honest in a way the mansion never had. "I'm not here to control you," he said finally. "Then why are you here?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because I don't want to lose you." The words surprised them both. Salma didn't respond immediately. Outside, children's laughter drifted upward again. Life continuing. Unaware that inside this small room, alliances were shifting, power was realigning, and a truth, long buried beneath boardrooms and acquisition papers, was inching closer to daylight. Salma Farouk had stepped out of the glass box.
Now the question remained, would Kunle step out with her or retreat back into comfort? Because once you leave the illusion of control, there is no safe way back.
The shelter did not smell like fear. It smelled like soap, like disinfectant and boiled rice and children's lotion. It smelled like women rebuilding themselves one careful day at a time. Kunle had never sat inside a place like this, without a security detail hovering nearby. Now he sat on a plastic chair in a narrow hallway while two toddlers chased each other past his polished shoes. He looked out of place. Salma noticed. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly from the doorway of her room. "I'm not here out of obligation," he replied. She studied him carefully. "Then why are you here?" He didn't answer immediately, because the truth was still uncomfortable. "I need to understand what my family may have done," he said finally. "And if you discover they are involved," she asked. He swallowed. "Then I'll decide." Salma nodded slowly. "That's not enough." He frowned. "What do you want from me?" She stepped fully into the hallway, one hand resting lightly against her abdomen. "I want independence," she said calmly. "If this pregnancy continues, it does so under my terms." He crossed his arms. "Define your terms. No handlers." He hesitated. "Bissy is there for your protection. She is there for surveillance." He didn't argue. "Second," she continued, "I choose my own legal counsel moving forward. Not yours, not your family's. That will complicate paperwork. It already is complicated." He exhaled slowly. "And third," she held his gaze, "you will defend my dignity publicly. No silence, no distancing." The request hung in the air heavier than the others. Public defense meant risk. Investors, board members, his father. He knew it instantly. "You're asking me to take sides," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to stop pretending there aren't any." Silence lingered between them. In the room across the hall, a baby cried briefly before being soothed. Life, fragile and persistent. Finally, Kunle nodded once. "I agree." Salma's expression did not soften immediately. "You understand what that means?" "Yes, it means war." He gave a faint, humorless smile. Then it was already war. The next morning, Kunle returned to Adabio Capital headquarters. Glass walls, marble floors, controlled temperature, controlled voices. The boardroom meeting began sharply at 9. Chief Adewale sat at the head of the long table, gaze steady. "We need clarity," one board member said. "Media chatter is affecting projections," another added. "If the pregnancy is unstable, termination would mitigate reputational risk." Kunle felt the words tighten around his chest. Termination, mitigate, risk. He stood slowly. "The pregnancy is healthy," he said evenly, and the woman a director asked, "Also healthy." A pause. "Then why is she no longer at the designated residence?" another board member pressed. Kunle met their eyes one by one. "Because she chose not to be." Murmurs filled the room. Chief Adewale's gaze sharpened. "You allowed that I respected it." The word echoed differently in the sterile boardroom air. "Respect does not drive shareholder value," his father replied calmly. "No," Kunle said, "but exploitation destroys it." The room went quiet. He had never spoken like this during a board session. "We will release a statement." Kunle continued, voice steady now, affirming that Ms. Farouk is under full legal protection, that the pregnancy is proceeding responsibly, and that defamatory narratives will be addressed. "You intend to validate her publicly?" Chief Adewale asked. "Yes, that implies she deserves validation." "She does. The simplicity of the answer unsettled the room more than any argument could have. Chief Adebayo leaned back slowly. "You are allowing emotion to cloud strategy." Kunle did not sit down. "No," he said quietly. "I'm correcting it." Within hours, Adabio Capital's official social media channels released a formal statement. It named Salma Farouk directly. It condemned online harassment. It affirmed her autonomy. The reaction was immediate. Comment sections exploded. Some applauded, others accused. But one thing shifted clearly. She was no longer an unnamed surrogate. She was a person. At the shelter, Salma watched the statement on her phone. Her expression remained calm, but her pulse quickened. He had done it. He had stepped forward. Mama Effa, who had come to visit, leaned over her shoulder. "He is learning," the older woman murmured. Salma didn't smile. "Learning has consequences." Across town, Damilola slammed her tablet onto a glass table. "He's defending her," she said sharply into the phone. Her father's voice remained composed. "Then pressure his father. That risks exposure." "Exposure of what?" Senator Okonkwo asked lightly. Damilola fell silent. Because both of them knew the answer. Old board agreements, energy acquisitions, Farouk Global, the foundation beneath multiple empires. "We may need to accelerate," the senator said quietly. That evening, Salma received another call from the unknown number. "Things are moving faster than expected," the deep voice warned. "Yes," she replied softly. "I see that. You are forcing their hand. They forced mine first." A pause. "There will be retaliation. I expect it." When she ended the call, she looked out the small shelter window. The streetlights flickered below. She felt no fear, only momentum. Kunle arrived at the shelter again after dark. He looked exhausted, but resolved. The statement caused backlash, he admitted. "I know. My father is furious. Are you?" He shook his head slowly. "No." She studied him. Why he stepped closer. "Because for the first time, I'm not calculating how to contain you." The honesty startled her slightly. "You are still calculating something," she said gently. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm calculating whether my inheritance is worth defending if it was built on theft." The word hung heavily between them. "Theft!" Salma's throat tightened faintly. "You don't have proof yet," she said carefully. "No," he agreed, "but I have patterns." Silence settled. Outside, a motorcycle sped past. Somewhere in the shelter hallway, a woman laughed softly. Life continuing. "If this becomes public," Kunle said, "it won't just affect my father. I know. It could destabilize the entire board. I know. And you." She placed her hand gently over her stomach. "I have already lost everything once." He nodded slowly. That was the difference between them. He feared losing power. She had survived without it. "I will find the documents," he said finally. She met his eyes. "And if you do?" He inhaled deeply. "Then we bring it into the light." The decision hung between them like the edge of a blade, because bringing it into the light meant something irreversible. Investigations, arrests, collapse, or redemption. There would be no middle ground. Salma nodded once. Then, "Understand this," she said softly. "When truth surfaces, it does not ask permission." He gave a faint, solemn nod. "I'm beginning to understand that." Outside the shelter, Lagos moved as always, ambitious, restless, indifferent. But beneath its polished towers and guarded mansions, something was shifting. Alliances were cracking. Old agreements were trembling. And two people who had once stood on opposite sides of control were now standing at the edge of something far more dangerous: exposure. The next move would not be subtle, and once it was made, there would be no safe return. The video surfaced at 7:12 a.m. By 7:30, it was everywhere. By 8, Adabio Capital's stock had dipped 3%. The footage was grainy but deliberate. It showed Salma exiting the shelter, her headscarf loosely tied a small group of women standing behind her. The camera zoomed in aggressively on her stomach. A distorted voice layered over the clip from missing heiress to desperate surrogate. What is she hiding? Then came a second segment. Old photos of Farouk Global's boardroom. A freeze frame of Idris Farouk shaking hands with Senator Chinedu Okonkwo years earlier. A bold caption, "Corporate fraud exposed," by 9 a.m. national news outlets had picked it up. By 10,000 hashtags were trending. Hashtag Adabio scandal. Hashtag Farouk mystery. Hashtag bought womb. At the shelter, one of the volunteers rushed upstairs breathless. "Salma, you need to see this." Salma watched the video once, then again. Her expression did not change, but her pulse did. "They've connected it," she said quietly. Mama Ife, standing behind her, shook her head, slowly. "Men with power panic when old names rise," she murmured. Salma placed her phone down carefully. "They're trying to paint me unstable." Downstairs, the shelter's director approached cautiously. "There are reporters outside," she said gently. "We can call the police." Salma shook her head. "No police." She stood slowly. "I'll handle it." At Adabio Capital headquarters, chaos rippled through the executive floor. Board members spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Assistants moved quickly, phones pressed to ears. Kunle stood inside his office, watching the video on repeat. He felt anger first, then recognition. The editing wasn't random. It was surgical. His phone vibrated continuously. Investors, journalists, his father. He ignored them all. Instead, he dialed one number. "Dr. Amara," he said when she answered. "I need you to confirm publicly that Salma's medical records were tampered with." There was a pause. "You're escalating," she replied calmly. "Yes, and you understand what that implies." "Yes, I will release a statement," she said. "But once this is public, it will trigger investigation. That's the point." When he ended the call, he looked at his reflection in the glass wall. For the first time, he did not recognize the man staring back. At exactly noon, Salma stepped outside the shelter gates. The cameras surged forward. Microphones hovered inches from her face. "Ms. Farouk, are you manipulating this pregnancy for financial gain? Were you involved in Farouk Global's collapse? Is the Adabio family silencing you?" The questions collided in the air like weapons. Salma raised one hand gently. The movement was not dramatic, but it commanded silence. "I will speak," once she said calmly. The reporters leaned in. "My name is Salma Farouk," she continued, "daughter of Idris Farouk." A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. "I did not disappear because of guilt," she went on. "I disappeared because powerful people needed silence." The words landed heavily. "I am not unstable," she added evenly, "and I am not for sale." A reporter shouted, "Are you accusing Adabio Capital?" Salma held steady. "I am accusing corruption wherever it lives." The precision of the answer unsettled them. Behind the cameras, phones buzzed. Live streams multiplied. Within minutes, her statement was trending. In Ikoyi, Chief Adewale watched the clip in silence. His jaw tightened slightly. "She's dangerous," one board member muttered. "She's strategic," another corrected. Chief Adewale said nothing, but his eyes had darkened. Damilola paced across her living room. "She's turning sympathy," she hissed into the phone. Her father's voice remained steady. "She's stepping into light deliberately. And Kunle is supporting it." "Yes," the senator replied quietly. "Which means he's choosing poorly." Damilola stopped pacing. "Then we remind him what happens to poor choices." By mid-afternoon, Dr. Amara's statement was released. It confirmed falsified lab results. It confirmed external interference. It demanded investigation. The news cycle shifted instantly. What had been gossip became potential crime. Financial journalists began revisiting Farouk Global's dissolution. Energy sector analysts reopened old acquisition trails. Names resurfaced. Documents were requested. At Adabio Capital, the boardroom felt different. Not loud, not chaotic, but tense. Kunle stood at the head of the table this time. "I am authorizing an internal audit," he said evenly. Chief Adewale's gaze sharpened. "That is unnecessary. It is overdue." Board members exchanged uneasy looks. "You are inviting scrutiny," his father warned. "No," Kunle replied. "I'm refusing to fear it." Silence settled heavily. For the first time in years, the Adabio patriarch did not immediately respond. At the shelter, Salma sat quietly after her statement. Her hands rested on her stomach. Mama Efe watched her carefully. "You've opened the door," the older woman said softly. "Yes. Are you ready for what walks through?" Salma exhaled slowly. "I've been ready for 3 years." Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She answered without hesitation. "They're digging," the deep voice said. "Board minutes from Accra. Asset transfers from 2019. Senatorial ties." "Good," she replied. "You're forcing exposure faster than planned." "Yes." A pause. "There will be retaliation. There already is." When she ended the call, she looked out at the small crowd still gathered outside the gates. She did not feel fear. She felt clarity. That evening, Kunle returned to the shelter. He didn't arrive alone this time. A lawyer walked beside him. Independent. Not from Adabio Capital. He stopped in front of Salma. "I'm initiating a joint inquiry," he said quietly. Her eyes searched his face. "This won't be quiet." "I know. It could implicate your family." He nodded slowly. It already might. Silence lingered. "And you?" she asked. He met her gaze steadily. "If they built success on theft, I won't protect it." The weight of the words settled between them. Not romantic, not dramatic, but irreversible. Salma nodded once. "Then understand something," she said softly. "Once truth begins to rise, it doesn't stop at the surface. I'm counting on that." Outside, the city lights flickered to life again. But Lagos felt different now. The narrative had shifted. She was no longer the silent surrogate. He was no longer the distant heir. They had stepped into visibility together. And visibility is dangerous, because when hidden documents begin to surface, when falsified reports are exposed, when powerful men are named, the story stops being gossip. It becomes evidence. And evidence demands consequence. The storm was no longer forming. It had arrived. And the next move would not belong to bloggers or whispers. It would belong to the law. By morning, the gates of the private clinic were no longer just guarded. They were surrounded. Journalists camped on the pavement. Satellite vans lined the street. Security guards formed a tense perimeter as patients tried to slip quietly inside without becoming headlines. Salma adjusted her headscarf before stepping out of the car. Kunle had insisted on accompanying her, not as an executive, not as a handler, simply as himself. "You don't have to go through the front," he said quietly. "We can use the back entrance." Salma shook her head. "I won't move like I'm guilty." The statement wasn't defiant. It was resolved. They walked toward the entrance together. The cameras surged. "Ms. Farouk, are you cooperating with authorities? Is it true you've reopened Farouk Global's case? Mr. Adebayo, are you turning against your own family?" Kunle didn't answer. Not yet. Inside the clinic lobby, tension hung thick in the air. Receptionists avoided eye contact. Nurses whispered. Even the polished floors seemed colder than before. Dr. Amara approached swiftly. "You're being watched," she murmured. "I'm aware," Salma replied. As they moved toward the consultation wing, a clinic administrator stepped into their path. "There's an issue," he said stiffly. "What issue?" Kunle asked. "We have instructions to suspend services pending internal review." Salma's eyes narrowed slightly. "From whom?" The administrator hesitated. "From the board." Kunle's jaw tightened. "There is no legal basis for refusal of care." The administrator shifted uncomfortably. "This is temporary." "No," Salma said calmly. "This is intimidation." The word hung in the air. Before the administrator could respond, two security officers approached from the corridor. "Ma'am," one said firmly, "we need you to step outside." Gasps rippled through the waiting area. Salma felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, recognition. This was what they did when exposure grew inconvenient. They isolated, they removed, they humiliated. Kunle stepped forward immediately. "She is a registered patient," he said sharply. "You cannot escort her out." The officer's gaze remained cold. "We're acting on instructions," from who Kunle demanded. The officer didn't answer. He simply reached toward Salma's arm. The touch was brief, but deliberate. The waiting room fell silent. Phones rose, recording. The moment stretched thin and sharp. Salma did not pull away. Instead, she lifted her chin. "My name is Salma Farouk," she said clearly, "and I am being denied medical access without cause." Her voice carried, calm, controlled, unshaken. The officer's grip loosened slightly under the weight of the cameras. But then deliberately, he gestured toward the door again. "You must leave." For a brief second, Kunle hesitated, because pushing further meant escalation. It meant confrontation that could not be undone. Salma felt it, that flicker, that calculation. She turned to him quietly. "Answer your phone," she said softly. He frowned. "But it's been vibrating for 5 minutes." Only then did he notice. An international number, repeated, persistent. He stepped aside and answered. "Kunle Adebayo." The voice on the other end was calm, accented faintly. "Mr. Adebayo, this is Emmanuel Owusu, legal representative of Farouk Global Holdings Accra Division." Kunle's pulse quickened. "Yes, we've been attempting to reach you. The Ghanaian Financial Crimes Commission has reopened the 2019 dissolution inquiry." Silence pressed around him. "We have located archived board minutes, implicating joint Nigerian investors," the voice continued, "including Adabio Capital subsidiaries." The world seemed to narrow. "Are you certain?" Kunle asked quietly. "We are certain enough to issue warrants pending cooperation." The officer's hand remained hovering near Salma's arm. The administrator looked increasingly uneasy. "Ms. Farouk's testimony will be required," Emmanuel added. Kunle's grip tightened on the phone. "And if she is denied access or intimidated," the lawyer said calmly, "it will be included in our filings." The call ended. Kunle stood frozen for a second. Then he turned. His face had changed. The hesitation was gone. "Remove your hand," he said coldly to the officer. The room held its breath. "You are obstructing a federal investigation," he continued evenly, "and every second of this is being recorded." The administrator paled. "Mr. Adebayo, you will provide medical care immediately," Kunle finished. Something in his tone had shifted. It was no longer defensive. It was declarative. The officer stepped back. Phones continued recording. Salma walked forward without rushing, without trembling. Dr. Amara nodded once as they entered the consultation room. The door closed, but the moment had already escaped into the world. Outside the clinic, headlines shifted again within the hour. "Clinic denies care amid corporate investigation." "Farouk case officially reopened." "Adabio, air brakes with family." Inside the consultation room, Salma sat on the examination table, breathing steadily. "You're shaking," Kunle observed softly. "Only slightly," He exhaled. "The case is reopened." She nodded once. "I know. You knew I hoped." Dr. Amara interrupted gently. "Blood pressure stable. Baby stable." Relief washed through the room, quietly. For the first time that day, Salma allowed herself to close her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked at Kunle differently. "Now you see," she said softly. "Yes," he replied. "This is no longer rumor. No, it's evidence." He nodded slowly, and evidence moves fast. In Ikoyi, Chief Adewale watched the clinic footage replay on a large screen. His expression did not change, but the silence around him thickened. One board member cleared his throat nervously. "The Ghanaian Commission has formally requested documentation." Chief Adewale's fingers tightened slightly around his walking stick. "Prepare statements," he said calmly. "Public or private?" Another asked. "Both." The board members exchanged uneasy looks, because they understood something clearly. Now this was no longer manageable gossip. It was legal exposure. In a penthouse overlooking the city, Damilola stared at her phone in disbelief. "They reopened it," she whispered. Her father's voice remained composed, but thinner than before. "We expected resistance," he said, "but not acceleration." She paced rapidly. "This could connect everything." "Yes," he agreed quietly, "which means mistakes are no longer allowed." Damilola stopped pacing. "And if Kunle cooperates?" The silence on the other end was longer this time. "Then we adjust," the senator said. Back at the shelter that evening, Salma stood alone for a moment before entering. She looked at the sky, now deep indigo. 3 years of silence had led to this. 3 years of patience, of disappearance, of waiting for the right alignment. She placed her hand gently over her stomach. "We are almost there," she whispered. Behind her, Kunle approached quietly. "They will fight," he said. "Yes, they won't surrender easily. I know." He stepped closer. "And neither will you." She looked at him. "No." For the first time, they were not standing on opposite sides of control. They were standing on the same side of truth, and truth, once set in motion, is relentless. The clinic confrontation had not been about access. It had been about power, about who could deny care, about who could erase narrative, about who believed they were untouchable. Now the law had entered the room, and when law and evidence begin to align, empires tremble. The investigation had officially begun. The next step would not be whispers or blogs. It would be boardrooms, subpoenas, names spoken aloud. And when those names were spoken, there would be no hiding behind silence. The reckoning was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The first subpoena arrived at Adabio Capital before sunrise. It was delivered quietly, by hand sealed in a thick envelope, bearing the insignia of the Ghanaian Financial Crimes Commission and co-signed by Nigerian federal investigators. No press, no spectacle, just paper. And paper in the world of power was more dangerous than noise. Chief Adewale held the envelope without opening it for nearly a full minute. The boardroom was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Finally, he slit it open. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His jaw tightened, but his expression did not break. "They are requesting archived acquisition files from 2019, he said evenly. A murmur passed through the board members, specifically, energy subsidiaries absorbed during Farouk Global's dissolution. One director shifted uncomfortably. That acquisition passed compliance review, he insisted. Chief Adewale looked up slowly. "Compliance can be negotiated," he replied. Silence. Because everyone in that room knew the truth behind that sentence. Across the city, Kunle sat inside a modest conference room arranged by the independent legal team he had retained. The contrast between the shelter and this space felt symbolic. Not polished marble, not towering glass. Just wooden tables, stacked files, and honest tension. Salma sat beside him, posture straight, expression calm. Across from them, Emmanuel Owusu, joined via secure video call from Accra. We have traced irregular transfers through 3 holding companies. Emmanuel explained, projecting documents onto the screen. The room dimmed slightly as spreadsheets and corporate flowcharts illuminated the wall. Adabio Capital subsidiaries acquired Farouk Global's Ghanaian solar division at below-market valuation, Emmanuel continued. The acquisition occurred 2 weeks after regulatory freezes were imposed. Kunle leaned forward. Regulatory freezes initiated by anonymous whistleblower complaints. Salma's eyes darkened. We never had internal complaints, she said quietly. Our audit reports were clean. Emmanuel nodded. The complaints were filed externally. Kunle understood instantly. Manufactured instability, freeze liquidity, force undervalued sale, acquire through layered entities, clean the trail. He looked at Salma. Do you have proof tying this directly to my father? Salma hesitated. Not yet. Emmanuel's voice cut in. But we have correspondence. The screen shifted again. Emails surfaced, encrypted threads between intermediaries. One name repeated often, Tajuddin Adebayo, Kunle's uncle, board strategist, the man who handled cross-border negotiations. Kunle's stomach tightened. This is circumstantial, he said carefully. For now, Emmanuel replied. But when combined with asset redistribution patterns and senatorial lobbying records, he did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. At the Ikoyi mansion, Damilola arrived unannounced. She found Chief Adewale standing by the window looking out over the lagoon. They're moving faster than expected, she said. Yes, he replied calmly. And Kunle. He has chosen visibility. Damilola's lips tightened. Then we must make visibility costly. Chief Adewale turned slowly. Careful. You're worried, she asked. I'm calculating, he corrected. She stepped closer. If this reaches full inquiry, your brother will not remain silent. Chief Adewale's expression hardened faintly. My brother will protect the family. Or himself, she countered. The possibility lingered heavily in the room, because self-preservation often outweighed loyalty. Back at the shelter, Salma received a second call from Emmanuel later that evening. There is something else, he said. Yes, your father's final board recording. Salma's breath caught. What about it? We located an archived security backup. The recording was deleted from official records, but not from third-party storage. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Does it mention names? It mentions resistance, silence, and it mentions an offer. Emmanuel continued. What kind of offer? A buyout refusal. Salma closed her eyes briefly. She remembered that meeting. Her father had refused a sudden acquisition proposal, one pushed aggressively by Nigerian investors connected to Adabio subsidiaries. He had called it predatory. Within weeks, the whistleblower complaints appeared. Then the freeze, then collapse. Can you send the recording, she asked. It will be submitted as evidence, Emmanuel replied. But prepare yourself. That night, Kunle arrived again at the shelter. Not in a suit, in simple trousers and a shirt with rolled sleeves. He looked less like an heir, more like a man trying to untangle something he had inherited without asking. They found a recording, Salma told him. His eyes searched her face. And it supports coercion. He exhaled slowly. This is getting bigger. It was always big. He nodded. Yes. She studied him carefully. Why are you still here? The question wasn't accusation. It was assessment. He sat down across from her. Because if my family built part of their success on sabotage, he began, voice low, then silence makes me complicit. The word complicit lingered. Salma looked down briefly at her hands. You understand that exposing this could dismantle your inheritance. Yes. And your father. He paused. He will not forgive me. Silence settled. And you? She asked softly. Will you? The vulnerability in the question surprised them both. She held his gaze steadily. If you stand fully in truth, she said quietly, for the right reasons, not for me, not for optics, then forgiveness is not what you'll need. What will I need? Integrity. The word felt heavier than wealth. The next morning, the leaked board recording hit investigative journalists. The audio was not perfect, but clear enough. Idris Farouk's voice filled the broadcast. I will not sell, under coercion, he said firmly. We built this company ethically. If you threaten regulatory freeze, we will challenge it. A second voice, unidentified, responded coolly. Markets respond to pressure, Mr. Farouk. The clip ended abruptly. The impact did not. Financial analysts began revisiting the timeline. Regulatory freezes filed 2 days after that meeting. Asset undervaluations within weeks. Adabio subsidiary acquisition immediately after. The pattern sharpened. In Ikoyi, Chief Adewale watched the clip without blinking. Board members shifted uncomfortably. One finally spoke. If this escalates to joint prosecution, it won't, Chief Adewale said calmly. But his hand tightened around the remote control. In a quiet cafe across town, Tajuddin Adebayo sat alone watching the same clip on his phone. His face drained of color. He dialed a number quickly. Chinedu, he said when the senator answered. This is unraveling. Hold steady, Senator Okonkwo replied. Your daughter accelerated too aggressively. Your nephew is cooperating. Silence. We may need to contain him, Tajuddin muttered. The word contain echoed ominously. At the shelter that evening, Salma felt a strange stillness. Not calm, not fear, momentum. She stepped outside briefly for air. Kunle joined her. They're calling an emergency board session tomorrow, he said quietly. She nodded. They will ask you to deny knowledge. Yes. And he looked at her carefully. And I won't. The certainty in his voice was new, not reactive, not emotional, resolved. She studied him for a long moment. Then tomorrow, she said softly, you stop being heir and become what he asked. She met his gaze. A witness. The word changed everything. Because heirs protect legacy, witnesses expose it. Inside boardrooms and government offices, files were being pulled, statements drafted, defenses rehearsed. But the truth was no longer abstract. It had voice, it had documentation, it had momentum. And tomorrow, when the emergency board session convened, lines would be drawn publicly. No more ambiguity, no more calculated silence. Only choice, and choice once declared cannot be undone. The emergency board session began at exactly 10 a.m. No delays, no informal greetings. The air inside the Adabio Capital headquarters felt tight, compressed like a storm waiting for the first crack of thunder. Kunle entered alone. He had declined his father's offer to coordinate messaging beforehand. He wore a simple dark suit, no flamboyant tie, no statement watch, just presence. At the head of the long table, Chief Adewale sat upright, walking stick resting beside him. Tajuddin Adebayo occupied a seat to his right face, composed but unusually pale. Several external legal advisors sat along the far wall. 2 federal observers were present, quiet, note-taking, watching. The glass walls of the boardroom reflected Lagos's skyline like a silent witness. Chief Adewale began. We are here to assess the reputational and legal implications of recent allegations, he said evenly. Kunle did not sit. I am here to state my position. He interrupted calmly. A flicker of irritation crossed his father's face. You will speak when recognized. I recognize myself, Kunle replied. Silence struck the room. The federal observers looked up. Kunle placed a slim folder on the table. Independent counsel has reviewed the 2019 acquisition trails, he continued evenly. There are sufficient irregularities to warrant full cooperation with Ghanaian authorities. Murmurs rippled. Tajuddin leaned forward sharply. That is speculative. It is documented, Kunle corrected. He slid copies of the archived board recording transcript across the table. Chief Adewale did not touch the papers. You are damaging this family publicly, he said quietly. No, Kunle replied. I am preventing deeper damage. The word deeper carried weight. Your loyalty appears confused, Tajuddin snapped. Kunle turned toward him. My loyalty is not to concealment. The federal observers exchanged brief glances. Chief Adewale finally spoke again. Voice lower now. You are prepared to testify, yes. The answer landed with finality. Silence filled the room. Outside the glass walls, the city moved as always, indifferent to power struggles behind tinted windows. Inside, something irreversible had just occurred. Across town, Salma stood at the entrance of the Lagos High Commercial Court building. She was not scheduled to testify that morning, but she had been advised to be present, not hidden, not waiting in shadow. Present. A modest crowd had gathered journalists, observers, activists who had followed Farouk Global's collapse years earlier. She wore a simple cream-colored dress. No excess, no spectacle, just composure. Mama F stood beside her quietly. You look like someone walking into destiny, Mama F murmured. Salma exhaled softly. I look like someone tired of waiting. Inside the courtroom, preliminary motions were being filed. Legal teams from Ghana and Nigeria coordinated jurisdictional frameworks. It was procedural, technical, but symbolic. Because for the first time in 3 years, Farouk Global's name was being spoken inside a legal chamber, not as scandal, but as case. Back in the Adabio boardroom, tension escalated. Tajuddin's voice rose slightly. You cannot hand over internal files without board authorization. I already have, Kunle replied calmly. The room erupted in overlapping protests. Chief Adewale's walking stick struck the marble floor once. The sound silenced the room. You have exceeded your authority, he said coldly. I have corrected it, Kunle answered. The difference between those two sentences fractured the space between father and son. Do you understand the consequences? Chief Adewale asked. Yes, you will forfeit your board seat. Yes, you will forfeit succession. Kunle held his father's gaze steadily. If succession requires silence, then it is not worth inheriting. The sentence did not echo. It settled, heavy, final. The federal observers resumed writing. Because this was no longer internal dissent, it was declaration. At noon, news broke across financial networks. Adabio heir commits to cooperation in Farouk case. Markets reacted immediately. Shares dipped again. Analysts debated long-term stability, but something else shifted to public narrative. For the first time, Kunle was not framed as a reckless heir or manipulated partner. He was framed as whistleblower. At the shelter, Salma watched the news clip quietly. Her expression did not soften, but her shoulders eased slightly. He had crossed the line. There was no return. In the Ikoyi mansion, Damilola paced like a caged storm. He's collapsing everything, she hissed into the phone. Her father's voice was sharper now. He's isolating himself, or aligning strategically, she snapped. Silence. We may need to distance ourselves publicly, Senator Okonkwo finally said. Damilola froze. Distance from who? From Adabio capital. The implication hit her like cold water. Because if alliances fractured, protection fractured too. By late afternoon, the High Commercial Court confirmed formal cross-border investigation status. Arrest warrants were not issued yet, but asset freezes were being reconsidered. Old regulatory complaints were being reopened. Salma was called inside for preliminary identification. She stepped into the courtroom slowly. The ceiling felt high. The air felt solemn. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just serious. When asked to confirm her identity for the record, she did so clearly. "My name is Salma Farouk," she said evenly. "Daughter of Idris Farouk, former chairman of Farouk Global Holdings." Her voice did not shake. Years of silence had taught her how to carry truth without trembling. As she exited, reporters waited again. "Do you believe justice will be served?" one shouted. Salma paused briefly. "I believe truth survives longer than lies," she replied. It was not flashy, but it was final. That evening, Kunle arrived at the shelter without escort. He looked different again, not anxious, not defensive. Resolved. "It's done," he said quietly. She studied him carefully. "You've lost your board seat." "Yes, and your father." He disowned the decision. Silence settled gently between them. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No." She held his gaze. "Why? Because I was raised to protect legacy," he said. "But no one taught me to question it. And now I am." The vulnerability in his voice felt earned. Salma stepped closer. "This is only the beginning," she warned softly. "I know, there will be retaliation. I expect it. And if your family fractures—" He inhaled deeply. Then it was already fractured. The words hung between them like an unspoken truth. Outside, Lagos shimmered under evening lights. Boardrooms were unsettled. Political alliances were shifting. Legal documents were multiplying. Power was recalibrating. For the first time in years, Salma felt something she had not allowed herself to feel: momentum without fear. Not because the fight was over, but because the silence was broken. Tomorrow would bring subpoenas, statements, perhaps even arrests. But tonight, the line had been crossed, and once crossed, there was no return to controlled ignorance. Heir had become witness, surrogate had become accuser, and the empire built on quiet acquisitions was beginning to tremble under open scrutiny. The final reckoning was no longer distant. It was approaching, and this time, no one would be escorted quietly out of the room. The arrests happened at dawn. Not dramatically, not violently, just methodically. 2 black government vehicles rolled quietly into the driveway of the Ikoyi mansion. As the first light touched the lagoon, uniformed officers stepped out with sealed documents in hand. Inside, Chief Adewale was already awake. He did not appear surprised. Tajuddin Adebayo, however, did. When the officers presented the warrant, his hands trembled for the first time in years. Financial manipulation, cross-border coercion, regulatory interference, the lead investigator recited evenly. Chief Adewale watched his brother closely. "This is political theater," Tajuddin muttered. "No," the investigator replied. "It is documentation." He was escorted out without spectacle. Cameras waited beyond the gates, but the arrest was quiet, almost restrained. Because real power rarely collapses loudly, it shifts. By mid-morning, news outlets confirmed that Senator Chinedu Okonkwo had also been summoned for questioning regarding coordinated regulatory complaints filed against Farouk Global in 2019. Damilola watched the headlines in stunned silence. For the first time since the scandal erupted, she felt something she had not anticipated: isolation. Her phone remained still. No calls from investors, no calls from allies. Because proximity to corruption suddenly became expensive. At the shelter, Salma stood near the window as the news played softly on a small television in the hallway. Mama Efe squeezed her hand. "You did not shout," the older woman said quietly. "You waited." Salma exhaled slowly. "Justice does not rush," she replied. "It accumulates." Her phone buzzed. A message from Emmanuel Asset Restoration Proceedings initiated. She closed her eyes briefly. 3 years of erased identity, 3 years of silence, 3 years of being reduced to rumor. Now the paper trail was speaking. Kunle arrived shortly after noon. No suit, no entourage, just exhaustion and clarity. "It's official," he said softly. She nodded. "Yes, my father is under inquiry." She studied his face carefully. "And I am no longer a board member." The words carried both loss and release. Silence lingered between them. Then she asked the question that mattered. "What happens now?" He looked at her, then at the small hallway where women moved quietly with children. "I don't rebuild that empire," he said slowly. "Not as it was." "And the child?" she asked, gently. His gaze softened. "That decision is yours." The simplicity of the answer carried weight. For the first time, he was not claiming lineage, not asserting inheritance. He was acknowledging autonomy. Salma placed her hand over her stomach. "I will not raise this child in secrecy," she said, "nor in scandal." "No," she agreed, "in truth." He nodded once. "Then we build something new." She studied him carefully. "Not as redemption," she said softly. "Not as compensation." "No," he replied, "as responsibility." The difference mattered, because redemption sought forgiveness. Responsibility sought change. 2 weeks later, in a modest press conference, organized jointly by legal representatives from Ghana and Nigeria, Salma stood before cameras once more. But this time the tone had shifted. Not scandal, not spectacle, resolution. The investigation confirmed coordinated regulatory manipulation against Farouk Global. Asset redistribution trails were traced. A portion of the original company's holdings were legally restored to the Farouk estate. Tajuddin Adebayo formally resigned from all corporate positions pending trial. Senator Okonkwo issued a guarded public statement, denying intentional wrongdoing while cooperating with authorities. The press asked Salma one final question. "What will you do with Farouk Global now?" She answered without hesitation. "We will rebuild ethically," she said calmly. "Energy that serves communities, not politics." Her voice was steady, measured, forward-looking. Later that evening, Salma returned to the shelter one last time, before moving into a new residence, modest, not extravagant. She did not choose a penthouse. She chose a home near the coast, open air, no glass towers. Mama Ife hugged her tightly. "You are not a victim," the older woman said softly. "No," Salma replied. "I am a witness." Outside, Kunle waited quietly. Not as owner, not as heir, as partner in rebuilding. He approached her slowly. "There is something else," he said gently. She looked at him. "I've resigned formally from Adabio Capital." She nodded once. "I expected that." "I don't want inheritance tied to silence," he continued. "I want to invest in restoration." She studied him carefully. "This cannot be about us alone," she said softly. "It isn't," he replied. "It's about structural change." "Yes." She held his gaze. "And if it costs comfort," he smiled faintly, "it already has." For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile in return. Not romantic, not triumphant, just real. Months later, as the Harmattan winds softened and Lagos shifted into another season, Salma stood on the balcony of her new home, overlooking the ocean. Her pregnancy had advanced steadily. Healthy, strong, not hidden. She reflected on the path behind her. From boardroom to bridge, from bridge to contract, from contract to courtroom. Not once had she begged for mercy. She had demanded accountability. Kunle stepped onto the balcony quietly. "The foundation paperwork is complete," he said softly. "Farouk Renewable Initiative launches next quarter." She nodded. "Community solar grids first," she said. "Rural focus." "Yes." He paused. "I never asked you something important." She turned toward him. "What do you forgive me?" The question lingered between sea breeze and memory. She looked at him for a long moment. "You were not the architect," she said softly. "You were the inheritor, and you chose truth." He waited. "I don't forgive you," she continued gently. "I respect you. The difference mattered." He exhaled slowly. "That's enough." Below them, waves crashed steadily against the shoreline. Not loud, not violent, persistent, just like truth. The child inside her shifted gently. A reminder that life continues beyond scandal, beyond collapse, beyond inheritance. Salma rested her hands against her stomach. "We are not raising a legacy," she said quietly. No, Kunle agreed. "We are raising a conscience." The wind carried the words outward, into a city that had witnessed power bend and break, into communities that had watched justice unfold slowly, into a future no longer defined by silence. Because sometimes the greatest shift is not when the powerful fall, but when the quiet stand up and refuse to disappear. And Salma Farouk had never intended to disappear again. When power is misused, it does not crumble overnight.
It layers itself in contracts, in polite boardroom language, in silence disguised as stability. But truth has a different rhythm. It waits, it gathers, and when it rises, it does not shout, it simply stands. Salma's journey was never about revenge. It was about dignity, about refusing to let her story be written by those who benefited from her silence. Kunle's journey was never about romance. It was about conscience, about discovering that inheritance without integrity is emptiness. In life, we may not control where we begin. We may not control who tries to define us, but we always control whether we remain silent in the face of injustice. If this story touched you, tell us what country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you believe in stories about justice, healing, and courage that grows quietly, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy we leave behind is not wealth, it is truth.